The Charge Syndrome Foundation Speaker Series. Hand flapping, presented by Kate Beals.
Sometimes parents have questions about movements that their children make with their hands, and that often is called flapping. You might see children moving their hands back and forth, like waving, or maybe one hand in front of the eyes, or even flapping their feet as they take steps. But I'd like to talk more about today is about flapping of the hands. And that is this repetitive movement of the hands in whatever plane the child chooses to do it.
What are the reasons for flapping?
The reason for flapping, if we want to look at the reason that children do flap their hands, we have to look at what the function of the flapping is. What do they get out of doing it? And in order to understand that, we have to think about the brain. And when we think about the way that the brain works, when we're very young, and in fact throughout life, the brain needs a certain amount of sensory input in order to grow and to develop. And for children who have Charge syndrome, many of their sensory systems that bring information about the world around them and about their bodies, that bring that information into the brain, many of those sensory systems are not functioning accurately or functioning well. The information that goes into the brain may be absent altogether. It may be diminished in some form, or it might be distorted. And so they're not receiving the full amount of sensory input that a child who does not have Charge syndrome would be getting. And we know that a significant lack of sensory input is similar to what they call sensory deprivation. And sensory deprivation is damaging to the brain. So in order to make up for the input that they may be missing from other systems, oftentimes children who have Charge syndrome will use a repetitive movement like hand flapping in order to get extra input that children who see well and hear well and who have a good vestibular sense and a good proprioceptive sense, they don't need that extra input. But a child who's missing input from those other senses needs a way to get extra. And I think that flapping is one of the ways that they do that.
Why are children with Charge often sensory seekers?
So because children who have Charge syndrome are lacking input from all, it can be all 7 sensory systems, they are often what we call sensory seekers. So they go out of their way to get extra input in whatever ways that they can. And of course, one of those ways is by flapping the hands. Well, why hands? In the first place, hands have lots of joints. Hands and our fingers have lots of joints in them. And there are important receptors for proprioceptive input in those joints and muscles. So you've got a lot of proprioceptive input to come through the hands and fingers. Also, hands are very portable, and we almost never leave them at home or lock them in the car and forget to bring them with us. So they're always available to children. And I think that makes hands particularly appealing when children are looking for that extra sensory input. In addition to that, proportionately, in terms of the area of the brain that is devoted to both the sensory and motor function of the hands, there's more brain area that's devoted to the hands than to other parts of the body, with the exception of the mouth and the facial area around the mouth. So by moving hands rapidly and with force, the child gets more bang for their buck than they might by using a different body part.
Does the amount of flapping change depending on stress?
I would suggest that the flapping may simply be a form of seeking sensory input, but you might see it increase when the child is feeling stressed or feeling frustrated, because getting a lot of extra proprioceptive input is calming and organizing. And so you might see the behavior increase when the child is feeling stressed.
Should parents try to reduce or stop flapping?
So some families wonder if they should stop a child from flapping. And I would suggest that it's okay to let the child go ahead and flap. That there are many other fish to fry when a child has charge syndrome, and that folks need not be too worried about flapping, except in the case where the flapping is injuring the child. If they're flapping against a hard surface, or, for example, hitting the hands against the mouth. I've worked with several children who have used their hands to hit their head or hit an eye or to hit a tooth. And in those cases, we've had to do some things to protect the skin from being injured.
What might help reduce flapping?
What I would offer to families is to try to deliver that sensory input in a safe way and really deliver it before the child is desperate to get it. So if you can add resistance to an activity that the child does with his or her hands, for example, using Play-Doh or clay or squishing bread dough or things like that, that will bump up the amount of proprioceptive input that they're getting in a way that is both functional and safe.
How can parents make their child's flapping functional?
Do you know what I thought was brilliant at the conference last night? I thought the use of the pom-poms at the welcoming session was brilliant, because the kids who are doing this, you stick a pom-pom in that hand and all of a sudden it's functional. They're having a ball, they're getting the sensory input that they need, and they're celebrating a great time with their family and their friends. So I was really excited to see the use of the pom-poms. While the flapping hands without an object can be inherently satisfying to the child because of the proprioceptive input that they get from doing that, I think you can also take it and extend it to become something that's functional at some point. This is not something that happens overnight, but the goal is to make any behavior become functional, right? So a thing that you might do is to add a drum or pat together on a ball. And patting on a ball can become a turn-taking activity that becomes a foundation for communication. So taking turns patting in a certain rhythm, or the child pats once and then I pat once, or I pat twice and maybe the child then pats twice. But it's a way to take the hand flapping and turn it into something that involves another person, that involves a partner, by using the ball or by using a drum, or by adding a mallet and doing it on a xylophone.
Which specialists might be helpful with these issues?
So if parents see a very young child beginning to engage in the behavior of hand flapping, there are plenty of resources that they can look to. I think I would first suggest seeing an occupational therapist who has some knowledge of sensory integration and sensory processing issues. Often the physical therapist can also help with it. And I would also urge parents to not worry about it too very much. If there are other issues in charge syndrome, other medical issues that will really take priority during the very early years. And the flapping is not something that harms the child.
For information and resources about charge syndrome or to make a donation, visit chargesyndrome.org and click the links in the description below.